This is Global on BBC World News. I'm Mariam Mashiri. How to stave off a catastrophic economic collapse in Afghanistan. As people can't afford to buy food, the world's major economies put forward proposals to get money into the country. We'll hear from our correspondent in Kabul. Later on Global, the worst national public health failure in UK history. That's the conclusion of a damning report by British MPs on the initial response to the coronavirus pandemic. Biodiversity is under threat. As China hosts a UN conference, we look at what can be done to protect the variety of life on Earth. Accusations of cultural appropriation against Jesy Nelson as she releases her first solo song since leaving girl band Little Mix. Game on in South Africa. Spectators allowed in to watch a crucial Football World Cup qualifier, the first since the start of the pandemic. Welcome to Global. How to stave off an economic catastrophe in Afghanistan. Over 18 million Afghans are now in need of help, according to the United Nations. Well, people are struggling to pay even for basic necessities. Salaries are not being paid, the banking system is in disarray, and the price of food and fuel are soaring. In a virtual G20 summit hosted by Italy, world leaders have been putting their plans forward to help with the dire situation. Our correspondent Yogita Lamai is in Kabul and described the situation on the ground.
This 18 million number that the UN has been quoting for a few months now, who are in need of urgent life-saving support, as they put it, which means people who need basic food, medicines, just to survive the day. And in the past 1.5 months since the Taliban seized control of this country on the 15th of August, access to so many places has been difficult. We have heard the UN say since the 15th of August that their local staff are facing harassment and intimidation. So there is, the other challenge as well of people who are on the ground trying to deliver aid, but them not necessarily in every place being able to safely allow to do so. But today's announcement will certainly be a shot in the arm to organisations like the UN that are working here on the ground, who have been repeatedly saying that there aren't enough funds for the needs of Afghanistan and that Afghan people should not suffer irrespective of what the political situation is.
Well, that's Yogita Lamai in Kabul. James Landale, our diplomatic correspondent, joined me a short while ago to explain why Afghanistan is such a priority for the G20 leaders.
I think today was essentially just an early start to say, look, Afghanistan is something that has been hugely divisive within the international community, from the initial invasion through to the terms of the withdrawal just a few months ago. And I think today was an attempt by the international community, the broader international community, to say, look, where can we find those areas of common agreement to say, look, there is a problem. This is what the scale of it is. This is how we need to start thinking about it. So what the leaders and the senior ministers there, because it wasn't all heads of government, have agreed that they're going to give a new mandate to the United Nations to start addressing fundamentally the banking situation. At the moment, there is no money in the Afghan economy, in the structure, in the system. Public service salaries, hospitals, schools, none of that is getting any money at the moment. And the question is almost a technical one. How can they get that money in while parking all the political problems such as human rights, the rights of women and children and girls to be educated, official recognition of the government? It's a question of how they do that while taking some of the politics out, if that is possible. And
where are different countries in terms of where they stand at the moment? Because they'll be different if you went there from Russia and China.
The Russians and the Chinas, whose leaders did not turn up today. I mean, nor did the United Kingdom. Boris Johnson wasn't there; it was the British Foreign Secretary. But Russia and China are of the view that the politics is entirely separate, and it's not for the international community to start wagging its finger at the Taliban, saying you must behave like this on human rights or women or whatever. But large parts of the rest of the international community say no. Look, aid money it's one of the few levers that they have to try and persuade the Taliban administration to change their behaviour. So I think we're at the start of a process. The problem is the people of Afghanistan themselves don't have the time because winter is approaching. And one of the things that was made clear at today's summit is just how grave the humanitarian situation will become when winter comes. As always with these summits, there are pledges that are made, promises that are made, but what actually, concrete comes out of things like this? Good question. Far too early to tell. Mario Draghi, the Italian president, who's hosted today's event, is still on his backside, answering questions about this. There's very little actual, real substance. I mean, look, we know today, for example, the European Commission has announced another 700 million euros, a grand total of about €1 billion, for immediate humanitarian needs, both within Afghanistan and in the neighbouring countries. But this is small, modest amounts compared to the huge amounts of liquidity that it needs. I mean, the the Taliban government are asking for $9 billion of Afghan assets to be unfrozen around the world. Development aid that used to go directly to the governments there is obviously not going to it anymore. So there's that's the fundamental question. Yes, there's a humanitarian crisis that can be dealt with a bit of cash now, but there's a much bigger problem to be addressed, and they've yet to get agreement on that. The UK government's initial response to the COVID pandemic was one of the worst ever public health failures in the country's history. That's the verdict of an inquiry by MPs. It says both ministers and scientists waited too long to bring in lockdowns last year, costing many lives. And it says there were thousands of avoidable deaths in care homes. The report mainly focuses on the response to the pandemic in England and didn't look at steps taken individually by Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Our health correspondent Jim Reid reports.
It is completely unimaginable, and we're not at the peak yet.
In the spring of 2020, the government was, says this report, working in a fog of uncertainty.
I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
Scientists did not know how many were infected with COVID or how fast the new virus was spreading. Doctors and nurses were already struggling to cope.
When we brought back people from Wuhan in January, I was advised...
For months now, two groups of MPs have been taking evidence on the handling of the pandemic in England from people involved in key decisions at the time. Now, in this joint report, they criticise that early response. Instead of locking down quickly like some other countries, they say the government's scientific advisers felt there was no choice but to bring in social distancing rules gradually, letting sporting events go ahead and keeping borders open. And they say ministers did not do enough to challenge that advice.
What we conclude in this report is that the national response to COVID was a bit like a football game with two very different halves. And in the first half, we had some serious errors. We could have avoided a lockdown, but having got into the position where we had to have one, we should have locked down earlier. But in the second half, we had the vaccine rollout, which we describe as the most effective initiative in the history of UK science and public administration.
Some of the relatives of those who've died responded angrily to that comparison.
This isn't a game. My mother didn't lose her life in a game. I think she lost her life because of mistakes that were made.
The final report goes on to describe the rollout of the test and trace programme in England as slow and chaotic. It claims that the UK did not impose rigorous border controls quickly, letting in high numbers of infections from overseas. And it says the risks to care homes were not recognised soon enough, leading to devastating and preventable repercussions.
The mantra about protecting the NHS it is certainly solidified in this report that was what was happening. Social care was very much an afterthought.
The report, though, does also praise parts of the national response. The vaccine programme was picked out as a success, as were new treatments like dexamethasone, first developed for COVID use in this country. The government says it has not shied away from taking quick actions when needed.
We followed the scientific advice throughout. We protected the NHS from the surge of pressure that we saw in other countries, such as Italy. As you say, we got the vaccine deployed extremely quickly. But also what we know about the pandemic now is very different to what the level of knowledge was at the start.
Labour, though, said the report showed monumental errors had been made.
This was one of the worst public health failures in the UK. That is a damning indictment. And my thoughts are with the families who've lost people because of these failures by the government.
The last year has seen the country come together in support of the NHS. This report is just the first study of its kind to look back at what MPs call the biggest health crisis of the last century. Next spring, a full public inquiry will examine in detail what lessons should be learnt from the pandemic. Jim Reid, BBC News.
In just a few weeks' time, the COP26 UN summit will begin, which will bring the world together to try to combat global warming. Before then, though, another conference on biodiversity is being hosted in China right now. Biodiversity is the variety of all living things on Earth and how they fit together, bringing oxygen, water, food and countless other benefits. Well, today, President Xi Jinping has promised $250 million to help developing countries in the fight. Adriana De Palma is a biodiversity scientist at the Natural History Museum here in London. She explained why it's so important.
Biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth, and that's everything from fungi to orchids, earthworms to elephants. But protecting biodiversity isn't just about making sure that we have an absolutely beautiful and fascinating place to live. Biodiversity also is absolutely vital for our own survival. It provides us with a number of benefits: clean air and water, food and fuel, healthy soils, and it can even help improve our physical and mental health. But we're currently destroying biodiversity. So while climate change gets a lot of attention because of its impact on nature, and quite rightly so, actually the biggest threat right at this moment is the way that we use the land around us.
So explain how we are destroying it. What are we doing to the land?
So when we expand agriculture and urban areas at the expense of natural land, we're removing vital resources that support high biodiversity. And in many cases, that new human-dominated land is managed in a way that doesn't make space for nature. So, for example, by having really high-intensity, large-scale monoculture cropping systems. But again, climate change really is also a big factor, not just because of rising temperatures and sea levels, but also because we're seeing an increased frequency and intensity of extreme events like floods and droughts, which can cause suffering to both biodiversity and to people.
So we're obviously having this conference in China, hosted by China. What do you make of China's pledge to put money forward to help developing nations to combat the threat against biodiversity? Is that going far enough, do you think?
So I'm really encouraged to see new initiatives and pledges being made during COP. And, you know, it's great to see China really putting their weight behind biodiversity protection. But I think it's important to note that funding is just one of the many barriers to protecting biodiversity, particularly in the developing world. And I think countries really need to make a much more concerted effort to reduce their impact, not just in their own countries, but also outside of their borders as well. Because if we don't really take an international, global approach to protecting biodiversity, then we risk countries exporting their damage by importing products that might not be so environmentally friendly. So any biodiversity commitments we make, they have to cross borders if our biodiversity impacts are crossing those borders.
Adriana De Palma there from the Natural History Museum talking to me about biodiversity. The UK's Brexit Minister, Lord Frost, has said the post-Brexit trade arrangements which the UK negotiated with the EU aren't working and have to change. In the past hour, he said Britain would be tabling proposals which would allow goods to circulate freely between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, but wouldn't disrupt the EU's single market. Lord Frost said a political crisis was brewing because of the current arrangements.
The fundamental difficulty is that we're being asked to run a full-scale external boundary of the EU through the centre of our country, to apply EU law without consent in one part of it, and to have any dispute arising from these arrangements settled ultimately in the courts of one of the parties. The way this is happening is disrupting ordinary lives, damaging large and small businesses, and causing serious turbulence to the institutions within Northern Ireland.
Well, for more on why the UK is essentially unhappy with the current arrangements of the Northern Ireland Protocol, here's our UK political correspondent, Rob Watson.
When Britain decided to go for a hard Brexit, essentially to leave the European Union's single market and its customs union, that meant that you were going to need a regulatory border somewhere, right, between Britain and the European Union. And nobody wanted to have that border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland because of the history of violence in that part of the world. So the protocol essentially puts a sort of border, a regulatory border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, and it's that Lord Frost specifically said, look, we can't be administering the EU's borders for it in the middle of the sea. And of course, the sort of headline on this speech is essentially he's saying, look, we the British government will look carefully at the proposals that are expected to come from the EU tomorrow, but if we don't like them, if we think they're a threat to peace, we'll just walk away from it all.
That's Rob Watson, the UK political correspondent. Coming up on Global. Accusations of cultural appropriation against Jesy Nelson as she releases her first solo song since leaving the girl band Little Mix.
Mr. Boy?
You are on the fastest route.
Makes me feel sad. Nobody does it half as good as you.
Excellent timing, Mr. Bond.
DHL. Excellence. Simply delivered.
The day's most important stories sent every weekday morning direct to your inbox. Subscribe at bbc.com/newsdaily.
Welcome back to Global on BBC World News. Pledges of aid for Afghanistan as the world's major economies come together for a summit to try to stave off a crisis in the country. The UK's initial response to the COVID pandemic is one of the worst national public health failures ever, according to a report by British MPs. Now, it's been a long time coming, but South Africa's national football team are back in action on their Johannesburg pitch to the roar of a small crowd. South Africa is playing hosts to Ethiopia in a crucial World Cup 2022 qualifying match for both sides. Now, 2,000 people have been allowed to attend the event, a first since the COVID pandemic. Well, let's cross live now to Nomsa Maseko, who is in Johannesburg. And Nomsa, I can see the football is going on behind you. It must be really exciting for players and fans, at least, to start to be able to see live football being played in South Africa.
Well, it feels like being in a soccer stadium for the very first time. And this is the first time in 18 months that spectators are being allowed inside a stadium here in South Africa for this World Cup qualifier. And I can confidently say that South Africa's squad, Bafana, have just scored and they are leading currently 1-0. But the 2,000 fans in a 94,000 capacity stadium has angered many supporters who came out here wanting to come in, even carrying those vaccination cards to prove that they have been vaccinated, as that is one of the criteria for this to enter the stadium. But many others are still outside the stadium and have not been allowed in. And this is what they said to us earlier.
To be back is all right, but we are not happy at all. We have vaccination card, we have our ID, but we don't have ticket.
I'm vaccinated, I'm here, and then my age doesn't allow me now. I feel like I'm 21 years old because today I'm going to get where I belong at the stadium to show the people in my family. They will be happy to see me back on track. I'm happy that we've been released as prisoner. Today I'm going to watch my team, cheering my team. I'm going to Qatar. Qatar is calling my name.
So it seems like things aren't as well organised as some fans would have liked. But this has been a long time coming, hasn't it, Nomsa? Because South Africans have, they have had quite strict COVID regulations over the last 18 months. It's been a tough time.
It really has been a tough time. South Africa has faced one of the toughest COVID lockdowns in the world. There have been a lot of not only sporting events, but even workplaces that had to be shut down because they were not considered essential. But this time around, now that COVID regulations are being eased down, it is hoped that because the government is using this match as a pilot project to see how many more people it can get to get vaccinated, because millions more are still hesitant. So there is a hope that people will get vaccinated in order to be allowed to attend not only sporting events, but also concerts and other entertainment events.
OK, thank you. Nomsa Maseko there, our correspondent in Johannesburg. Good luck to both teams playing today. Jesy Nelson, the former Little Mix star, has denied that she's blackfishing in the video for her new solo single, Boys. Well, blackfishing is a word used to accuse someone of pretending to be black or mixed race. The rapper Nicki Minaj, who features on the song, has defended Jesy Nelson against those claims. Well, Steve Holden is a music reporter at BBC Newsbeat, and he explained more about what blackfishing means.
It's when somebody who is white or Caucasian is accused of essentially pretending to be black or mixed race for their personal gain, for their own profit. That could be done through the way they're dressed, their hairstyle, the makeup. It could be that they have a particularly dark tan. And some say that it's wrong for white people to gain or to profit by styling themselves using these largely black characteristics, when black people have themselves been held back for having those actual characteristics. So in the video for Jesy Nelson's new song, Boys, Jesy, who is white and from the UK, has a darker tan. She's got wigs, braids, she wears basketball shorts. She's got a backlash that she is indeed blackfishing.
I know that obviously this has caused a lot of controversy. What has Jesy said in response? Because I know that she has responded, and also she's been given support by the co-star of her video and the co-singer in her song, Nicki Minaj, as well, who is black.
Yes, so Nicki Minaj is the feature on this track. It's a big track, by the way. Jesy Nelson was part of Little Mix, one of the biggest girl bands in the UK, Europe, the world for the last 10 years, and went solo last year. Jesy denies blackfishing. She went on an Instagram live with Nicki Minaj last night and said that she never intended to offend anybody of colour. She said the music she was singing about was the music that she loved. When she was asked about her skin tone, she said that she'd been on holiday recently to Antigua and that as a white girl, she just happened to tan darker. And she did say that her former bandmate, Leanne Pinnock, who is a black member of Little Mix, had mentioned blackfishing to her in a previous video. And this was meant to be a big moment for Jesy Nelson. This is a big solo single, but it's been overshadowed by this blackfishing discussion. But as you said, Nicki Minaj, the rapper on it, has defended Jesy, saying that she deserves to kind of have this moment in the spotlight.
She has defended her, and also she said, look, Jesy has had issues with mental health in the past, and, it doesn't seem fair that people are bullying her over this.
Yeah, Jesy Nelson's always been very open about her mental health. She did a big documentary about cyberbullying, the way she felt, her own self-worth. She left Little Mix in the end because it was making her miserable, she said, and that she didn't like constantly being compared to her bandmates. So there's a lot of sympathy for Jesy Nelson. But in the same sphere, Leanne Pinnock, her black bandmate, former bandmate, has done a documentary about experiencing racism and colorism in the music industry too. Now, Little Mix, their strength has always been in their solidarity as a group. They are a sisterhood. They're a team. I've interviewed them many a time, and they're always brilliant. They're always tight. They've always got on. And I think a lot of people are now looking at what appears to be a rift between Jesy, who stepped out on her own, and the rest of the band who've continued as a trio. So while Jesy is meant to be having, as Nicki Minaj says, this moment in the spotlight, this conversation about blackfishing is kind of overshadowing things.
And ever the way, isn't it, really, Steve? I know you've been covering music for so many years, and for BBC Newsbeat as well. Ever the way with these girl bands, there always seem to be these issues at the end that kind of destroy them.
And that's the point. Little Mix always thrived on the fact they were never in the tabloid press. There was never rumours of infighting. The sisterhood, as we should call it, seemed genuine. And I think from a fan perspective, there's a lot of sadness now.
Well, now take a look at this picture, which was taken 2 years ago by a wildlife officer in a natural park in the US state of Colorado. Now, the elk that you see here is the one with a car tyre around its neck. It was spotted several times since then. So imagine it's had that tyre around its neck for 2 years. It was only tracked down this weekend and saved from this awful predicament. It's thought the animal is now some 16 kilograms lighter. That's some weight off its shoulders. And just to let you know, in about 35 minutes time, maybe a little bit longer, we will be talking to one of those park rangers who helped save the elk, who helped remove that horrible tyre. There they are there. You can only see their arm, but we'll be able to see their face soon enough. That's it for me. I'm back soon. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.